There is no protection better than preparation. So we put as much as possible the focus on being prepared and making sure that nothing actually is vulnerable by making sure that the security is part of life cycle of the design, build, test, release, and everything else. At the same time, again, it is inevitable. Things are changing very frequently, and environment that you thought would be completely safe might not be in a few weeks, days. As a result, the constant test and monitoring and having the specific factors added to our server monitoring has been part of the deal. So previously we would have only checked for is the server resources to the point and they are not failing or they are not being choking with under the load and everything else. Now we are looking into all sorts of the fraud detection and possible connect that might not be through the lenses that we are looking for. It is such an artful tuning for those monitoring system to avoid properly separate the actual customer from those that are actually a security threat. It is a very fine-tuned, again, activity that has caused us from time to time to actually deny a legitimate customer. But we are learning, we are tuning out our monitoring system and making sure that we are targeting only the ones that are not supposed to be there.
So to keep abreast of the latest information available, we have subscriptions to trusted threat intelligence sources to get the earliest possible information releases related to zero-day vulnerabilities, including daily reports from the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, Optiv's Threat DNA reports. The security team has automated tools that constantly scan our environments for published vulnerabilities. And when information about a zero-day vulnerability is released, we assess the potential impact to teachers, and we take any necessary immediate actions where required, and add the information into our vulnerability management dashboard. And this dashboard is reviewed by our CISO and head of technology infrastructure. We also work with our vendors to revalidate the technologies impacted by zero-day vulnerabilities, and we apply the vendor-supplied patches as soon as they're released. So remediation status is tracked and reported to our CISO and head of TI.
We have the super breach will happen, right? So obviously MDR, active threat hunting. We have AI-based threat hunting that manages through our network to see what's going wrong. Certainly updated EDR obviously is required as well. I go back to identity access management to know where your people are going. So we definitely, we segment our networks to prevent lateral movement. So we drive people to the applications that they only need and make sure that if something does happen, the threat can't laterally move across. Being a manufacturer, we have a lot of IoT devices, like conveyors, robots, CNC machines, etc. Some of them are old, so some of them are not patchable because they're black boxes. So we isolate those networks and we put them off net, and we update them in a very, very pragmatic, on net, limited time, isolated in a complete can so that nothing can get out, which I think is really important to make sure that we do that. And of course, like internal vulnerability tests to verify and validate the applications and to make changes to apps around that. I think that internal vulnerability test is very important. We do pen tests, of course, up from the outside, but the inside is where we really find ourselves that we could be vulnerable, and that helps in our segmentation as well. I think the other part is to measure. We have a security ratings report card system that I look at every morning before our daily operating control meeting and find out where we are in the patch cycle, even though we all have advanced patch cycles now, and we will actually shut down operations to patch if a big threat is out there, and that becomes first and foremost, right? So I think putting that policy in place is very helpful.
0 day, I think the whole terminology of 0 day means there is nothing you can do about it. So I think I'll go back to some of the basics that we've all been talking about is the preparation piece. I think somebody mentioned earlier. So from a standpoint of running tabletop exercising, doing scenario testing, having a good asset inventory, like a CMDB database that understand where your crown jewels are, protecting those appropriately, and testing your escalation and communications with the third parties, the other stakeholders, for example, all the way to the board. I think those are the things that are more relevant towards zero-day. The whole concept of zero-day is, no matter how many tests you can do, the solution doesn't exist. It does. The internal and external tests are not catching that vulnerability. That was the challenge with the Log4j as well, as we experienced in last December. So as much as I think about the protecting from zero-day, I go back to some of the foundational stuff that we all should be focusing on, as I mentioned. So I don't really have a silver bullet answer for zero-day, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And probably would be in Bora Bora after making my millions. So having said that, like I said, I'll go back to all the statements John and Michelle, and I think it was Nastaran as well that mentioned, and Aaron, of course, that let's prepare ourselves, do the proper testing, get your teams prepared, and and hope that if you do get hit, and we know from time to time we will, that you're prepared enough. That I think the focus should be on the time frame it takes you to identify the zero-day and remediating it, rather than trying to protect against zero-day, because that solution doesn't exist. So I think all you're trying to do is minimize the time that it takes you to recover from a zero-day vulnerability, if you end up experiencing that.
I'd go back and take a slightly different angle, just to hopefully not stay on the same conversation track and try and add. I read a great paper that broke zero-day into a few key terms. So like when something's announced as zero-day, unfortunately, that can also be just when the greater public knows about it. But like in the Exchange issue from last March, there was quite wide exploitation before it was a zero-day. And then it's the time period after that's announced and a patch is released that becomes day one. So everybody's got, hopefully, and I assume at this roundtable, like robust patching strategies that deal with vulnerability scanning, any patch. I can't double down on that enough to say that hygiene practice needs to be well oiled, simply because it gives you real quick, easy perspective to who needs to drop their pencils and work on something like Log4j when it comes out, depending on where it is, right? And if the well-oiled machine isn't there, then you're going to scramble and take a lot more time trying to figure out who needs to actually dive in here and be part of this work. The last thing I'd say is Log4j taught us to give our vendor governance group a different lens and a bit of a different mandate. And so as we were remediating that one and thinking through it, we really needed to work with a lot of our providers where we've taken critical business processes and shifted those to pure SaaS. We're now wholly reliant on that other company's internal business processes to fix their own issues. And so we've started a big dialogue internally about regularly exercising our contractual rights and making sure that we're doing more of that. Like while we had a program there to do it at a certain layer, Log4j, a few other events within the last 18 to 24 months have really emphasized to us that where we've got those critical business processes out with SaaS providers, really looking at our contractual language and making sure that we're routinely exercising those rights, just to take that reasonable person approach to say everything that we want to do to ourselves. Somebody on this call, when we first started it off, made that comment. Whatever we do to ourselves, we're also ensuring that our vendors are taking that same approach.
The vulnerabilities and remediation is truly where governance is leaned on, and that's truly when it comes to full bloom. So to ensure that the governance is truly adequate, and it is, to Blair's point, have a t-shirt size, but that can be adjusted depending on the vulnerabilities and the threats that they pose. The best is understanding the roles, responsibilities, the processes, and just to have a full awareness of the vulnerability, of the assets, inventory, of the entire workflow to remediation. I believe Nick mentioned that. Just to have that awareness that will then, have the well-oiled process. And at the very same time, focusing on the source of truth and analytical approach to our impacts, that is very important and very helpful. But also have a test that your incident response, have a scenario on a zero-day vulnerability. It's hard to test because it's hard to predict what they might be, but having an understanding of how the incident response teams cooperate with each other, who does what, so that when the pencils are dropped and everyone is running around, it's an organized, orchestrated effort. And it truly is a collaboration rather than trying to fix in a patch type manner. So from that perspective, I think governance is becoming truly a helping pillar that holds the house and protects it from all the negative weather impacts from the outside. The domain expertise, nobody knows our house better than we all do, right? So working with third parties, but also having the appreciation and the inputs from someone with domain expertise, I think that also is critical to success.
From time of detection to exploitation to remediation, I think is important. One way that we do this very efficiently at Lacework, which is a little bit different, is we take that approach that it's a data problem. It's not a rules problem, and it's not a detection problem. We need to have an approach that's based on continuous observability. And that means if you've observed your workload, you've observed your workflows, and you've observed your cloud experience way before any zero-day attempt, the exploitation of those attempts, either at publication or prior, will typically show up. You may not be able to have a clean remediation process, but the efficiency depends on your time to detection to your time of remediation. And I think a lot of people mentioned that as well. If you try to assess your exposure upon the publication of vulnerability and go back and try to see where your assets are exposed, you're a little bit late in getting to your remediation. So you need to be able to observe at any given time what your workloads do. And then whether it's exploitation before it's even published, see how your runtime reacts to these threats. And we've had a lot of success actually in December, and some of our customers, getting some alarms, getting some signals, either very close to the publication of CVEs or right before it, through having observed continuously over time what their workload relationship were, and understanding that all of a sudden they have Java processes, for example, with log4breach, that were doing things differently. So while there was no log4j-name, there was no log4shell, they understood that something was amiss and something was different. So if you understand where it is on your network, but more importantly, I think just to close in, is understanding how you triage to remediation. I think I heard a lot of people saying, patch is important, patch quickly, but you need to understand in a critical event like this, there's critical amongst equally critical, right? Understand what your exposure is, what the surfaces are, where your workloads are, having a triage so that your patch strategy deployment is optimized to get to remediation extremely quickly to the workloads that are being affected versus those that are compromised but not affected.